Okay, welcome back, anybody out there that's listening. I'm throwing this one together for a good friend of mine, kind of like the last one. I've said a lot on this podcast, which I love, but there's so many things to be said about injuries, psychiatric injuries, as well as lots of other kind of injuries that all kind of, if we look at them closely and we kind of step outside the Western medical paradigm, they're really not any different. I've spoken a little bit about it in the past, but there's these generalistic terms that I've come up with and these ideas that I think we should all study really carefully because they're kind of, in my opinion, the key to understanding human physical existence. I think we have, this kind of spiritual self, this mental self, and this physical self. They're all inextricably tied together. And yeah, there's things about it that you can study. If you pay close attention to your life, the life of people around you, I think it becomes pretty obvious. But most of us in the Western world have been taught to do the opposite, just to listen to others, not think too much for yourself and whatnot. So we can get on a track where this stuff doesn't make sense and where we believe so thoroughly in other kinds of thinking and rationale that actually aren't logical or actually don't fit what we're experiencing in life, that it makes it hard for us to understand what we are experiencing in life. I was certainly a victim of that. I mean, for a very, very, very long time. I'm lucky I had a little bit of an upbringing where I was to think for myself a little bit, but as I kind of became woven into society, I began giving up on all the things that I understood as a kid and thought they were kind of fake or they didn't work, but that was all a lie. So let's get back to it. This is to answer a really, really important question that a friend asked me. I was talking about central nervous system being agitated and dysregulated, and they asked me exactly what does that mean. So for people that are paying close attention or that have the perspective to understand what that means, then when you say it to them simply, then they will understand what you're talking about and they understand the dynamics and the ins and outs of the kind of details that you're talking about, right? However, if someone doesn't understand that way of thinking and they're used to thinking differently, it won't make sense, right? And it certainly, people had said it to me at certain points, and I had a really limited understanding of it, so I couldn't understand everything, but it struck me well enough that I knew I should start trying to understand. And as I started trying to understand, some really beautiful, wonderful things started happening where all these other pieces of my injury and other people's injury that I didn't understand, they all started coming together and falling under one umbrella. And which then, for me, birthed this theory of what I found was central nervous system, or CNS, agitation and dysregulation. So the more I thought about this stuff, I actually realized that instead of this being helpful as a generalistic way to understand what happened to us, I then found that it was actually the answer to what happened to us. And if we understand it thoroughly, if we have the answer, so if we understand fundamentally what happened, then we can undo what happened to us. We can change, we can get better, we can have a kind of peace and a calm inside ourselves because we know what's going on when it happens and we can figure it out. So it kind of makes us the master of ourselves, which includes if we have an injury or unpleasant things that are happening to us or any kind of sensations that are happening to us, that we can understand it, we can find peace with it, and then we can rectify anything that we want, or we can ignore anything that we want. It makes us kind of the masters of our own destiny, which is a really incredible thing. So my efforts here are to explain what CNS agitation and dysregulation is for specifically for granting and understanding and an ability to make changes for the better or worse, whatever we choose, fix it, right? So here we go. So if you think about it, when you're a child, and if you look at children, spend time with children, which I've talked about in the past, is really critically important, I think, for people that don't understand to begin understanding, you see they have like an internal rhythm, right? So they wake up, they have lots of energy, they play, and they do all sorts of stuff throughout their day. There's lots of understanding, there's lots of learning that takes place, and then they naturally get tired and they fall asleep. They take naps, right? Then they wake up, they do the same thing, and then they fall asleep at night. And if you watch the way they sleep really, really well, really deeply. And it's just kind of actually magical to watch, like how natural everything is for them. But again, if you pay close attention and you study it because you think it has some importance, right? So you really study it, so you're trying to learn and understand what's going on behind it. You'll see that everything in nature has a rhythm to it, and that it rectifies all the things in nature, right? It keeps it on a natural path, and sounds kind of hippy-dippy, right? But the value of being on that path is that things may get difficult for the creatures or life in nature, right? But it always gets rectified, right? It always comes back to this normal functioning that has this beautiful smell, taste, sight to it, right? And that's very different than what we see in humanity. We see a lot of violent things in humanity, a lot of suffering, a lot of violence on each other, verbally, emotionally, physically, right? Things you just don't see in nature, right? Like you watch nature documentaries and you think, okay, wow, this shows like an alligator eating like an antelope or something, right? Well, what you're not seeing a lot of times in there is that other times there'll be alligators right next to antelope and they won't be doing anything, right? They're not trying to eat it because it's not hungry, right? It's not wasting. It's not becoming violent for any exorbitant reason, right? So again, like if you take the time to study nature and the things around you to understand its true meaning, right, and the true rhythm to what's going on, there is a lesson there that transcends everything that we're taught in books and in our society and like Western society, right? So there's a rhythm to it all. There's a cadence to it all. Okay, so this is really important. We're going to come back to these recurring themes of cadence and rhythm, because if you pay attention from the beginning of life, so if you look at children, right, if you look at babies, there's a cadence and a rhythm to their life, and it's very natural, it's very clean, it's very beautiful, it's very wonderful, right? If we kind of step outside of ourselves, let go of our ego and all the idiotic thinking that we have and we've been taught, right, and we focus on what's actually there, you'll see something really amazing, right? And for those of us who have been injured, the really big thing is that you will see that it's very, very different than what we're experiencing now. Okay, if you take that toddler, right, and you expose them to trauma, let's say like violence, anger, it will change their cadence, right? It'll change their rhythm. So they'll start crying, like they'll do things to express they're in this sense of discomfort, right? And it's usually pretty intense. Like if you do something cruel to a child, like they'll react intensely, right? And then they'll rest at the end of the day. The next day, they might be kind of leery of you, right? They'll look at you. They'll have these feelings. You can tell they're experiencing these feelings of unease around you. You know, they might start to distrust you. And this is just for the youngest of kids, right? So there's a really incredible intelligence there as well that we can look at and understand as well, which is important for other reasons. And then if you're very caring and you're loving to them, you kind of turn back into a friend or a family, relationship with them, and you treat them well. Over time, their nervous system will settle back down over a very short period of time, right? So this rhythm, we're coming back to the rhythm. This rhythm that we see comes back into balance and alignment. You can say this about a very healthy adult. Say you just do something violent to them, or they experience something violent like a car accident, right? If anyone's ever been in a car accident, getting back into a car afterwards can be very difficult. Driving around in a car can be very difficult afterwards. Your nervous system is constantly looking that you're going to get hit again. Something violent's going to happen again. And it actually takes a really long time to get over that. I've been in an accident in the past. It actually took me, I realized it was like a year or more before I could really calm down. It felt like I got back to baseline after a car accident. And if we look at that, we think, take the car accident example. The car accident is extremely violent and abrupt. So The rhythm of our nervous system is in a one-time incident is very violently changed. Okay, so there's an echo that is relative to the amount of energy that goes into that incident, right? So say if a friend of us smacks us in the face, it's unpleasant and we may be a little nervous around them after that, but say they apologize afterwards and it's fine, right? There'll be this like a good amount of energy went into it, right? And it would say it was a surprise, right? But over time, over a few weeks, maybe a month or two, we'll feel really totally calm and at peace again with it, right? A car accident is much more violent. There's much more energy that goes into it. Our nervous system takes a hit, even though we might not perceptibly take the hit, right? We may not be conscious even during that accident, right? We may go unconscious. Our nervous system and its reaction will be extremely violent, right? But even though it's the quantity is the same, right? Like you get slapped in the face once, it might take a few weeks for your nervous system to calm down, or maybe you to come off edge, or be trusting again, right? In a car accident, it could take like upwards of a year or even more for some people, depending on the trauma, the fallout, right? Like even though the frequency is the same, they're both one-time incidents, right? So again, think back to the rhythm here, okay? Look at your nervous system as like a seismograph or like a heart monitor, right? Like with a regular rhythm and cadence that's natural, and then there's an extremely violent change to it. If the volume or the intensity of that change is very, very high, it will take much longer for that rhythm to come back, right? If the intensity is low, it will take less time, right? But if we think about our nervous system in this kind of, like if I picture it in my mind as like looking on a piece of paper, you're drawing a straight line when things are calm, and then there's something turbulent or traumatic, right? You draw a spike on the paper, but when it spikes up, however high it spikes up, it kind of spikes back down in the same amount of energy, right? And it's trying to rectify itself. So it's going up and down, kind of like a seismograph again with aftershocks, right? It's rectifying itself. It doesn't just go straight back to baseline and go straight, right? That's very difficult to do, or it's not very natural, right? It has this kind of memory, or it has a history, right? And to me, it all makes sense in my head. I'm trying to describe it well. So if we go back to the baby, right, or a child, right, if they have something like violent happen to them once, or even if they take a fall or an accident, right, they might be leery, they might become upset for a few days. But if we repeat that accident daily, right, say if they get hit daily or they get yelled at daily, we see these trauma responses forming. We see this much deeper change to their nervous system. So they'll start to act completely differently as time goes on, right? Because again, these jolts to the nervous system, if we're looking at the seismograph kind of thing, and thinking about how our body has like a memory, right? These are all ideas that I could expound on for hours and hours, but hopefully we have some idea of it, right? There's a history and there's a memory there, so we don't just go straight back to baseline. The baby doesn't go straight back to baseline, right? It starts developing different habits, right? And those habits become very reactive, right? Or they may even be proactive. Like even if they get a sight or a smell, or it's just that time of day, they may start freaking out and crying, or doing something to show that they're getting a trauma response to like their environment, right? Something's not right. Their nervous system is setting them into fight or flight in one way or another, right? You can see the way this rhythm or this cadence builds, and it changes and it shifts. And the more it changes and the more it shifts, the more this becomes habitual, right? The more it builds a pattern, right? Because what we can kind of, again, if we think about it intensely, right, and think about it thoroughly, like these patterns we see in nature and in a natural sense, they're very, very helpful, right? Like waking up, going to bed, exerting a lot of energy, like, and extending yourself, and then resting really well after that. These are all really healthy patterns. And the fact that we can establish patterns of healthy exercise or exertion, right, along with healthy rest, these are really great patterns. They work for us really, really well. So when we analyze it, we can see that nature is actually our ability to get in these patterns and this regulation, this rhythm is really, really helpful and really, really productive to human beings, to our mind, our spirit, and our body. It allows us to do amazing things. However, if these things are abused, or if they're if they're inflicted upon us in a negative way or a very violent way, right, that kind of falls outside this paradigm of nature that we can understand, then, okay, now we're at the kind of pinnacle of answering the conversation now that we've had a little, answering the question now that we've had a little bit of background. We fall into a central nervous system agitation and dysregulation. So, say you go into the doctor and they start giving you psychiatric medications, right? The central nervous system is meant to regulate itself. There's really no argument that can be made around that. To me, I've seen all the arguments. I've talked to so many people. I've experienced it for myself. So the nervous system, it's our brain and our nerves, right? And our spinal cord and all that, right? That organ and that's connection to our mind and our spirit, that's what governs everything in the body, right? So there's nothing above that, right? That is the system that regulates and controls everything. And it's meant to do it on its own, and it's meant to heal itself and take care of itself. That's the way it was designed. That's the way it's always worked, right? I'd be interested to hear an argument against that, but that's my understanding of it, right? And I've never seen anything to the contrary. If we start taking a psychiatric medication or go through a different psychiatric treatment, it's augmenting the way that the nervous system handles itself. So even though we may be experiencing a tremendous amount of stress or depression, these sorts of things, those things are natural, and the nervous system is doing that to try to rectify itself and try to get, kind of the host is trying to get your spiritual and mental being to make a change, right? To shift away from things that are horrible or bad. We can blame genetics, we can blame environment, we can do all these things, but we should always come back to this spot where we're in our body, we're experiencing life for a reason. It's got value, and it's inherently an important thing. People can make arguments around that. Oh, my environment was bad, my genetics were bad, all these different things. But when we make that argument, we start to nullify the value of life. And if we nullify the value of life, even if we can make an argument that life is unpleasant, we kind of get into a territory where there's no point to life, and I don't have any evidence or belief or reason to go there. I inherently think life has value and meaning, even if people fail to see it or can't see it or lose sight of it. And I've never had an argument that transcended that. So that's kind of a foundation for something that persons or people would believe in. Always interested to hear an argument against it. I just haven't found a real one that works, that is in opposition to that. There's some really extreme cases out there, and as we get through life, we see extreme cases like people that are born vegetables and all these certain things. I think there's value in all that. I think there's a human existence in there. I think there's an extreme amount of value in suffering. The more suffering I've done in my life, the more fuller of a person I've been afterwards. My understanding and wisdom has increased. All kinds of virtues have increased and become easier for me. I actually think, like, if someone was to make an argument, there's all this suffering and difficulty in life, and that some people are constantly trapped in it, and that devalues life or means life doesn't have meaning, or someone's life could be horrible and without meaning. I actually think the opposite's true. The more difficult our life is, the more meaning it has, and that's been my experience. It's been something I've observed in other people and learned about, and then it's also been my exact experience as well. So getting around that is pretty difficult for me. It's impossible for me. I've tried my whole life to understand the other side and tried to experience the other side. It just never worked. So definitely derailed there a little bit, but it's important. See, a part of this is all asking questions and understanding things for yourself, right? So working through those kinds of questions and those ideas is essential. If you can't get through that basic stuff or the fundamental understanding of kind of what life is and what it means to you, then learning this stuff about the nervous system becomes very, very difficult, I think. It doesn't have to be, but it could be. But we have to be able to think for ourselves and rationalize for ourselves. If I would have relied on the teaching and the understanding and the kind of reason that I was raised with, I never would have been able to understand and help myself through an impossible injury that no doctors have an answer to. And that is one rough situation to be in, when doctors keep giving you different answers and giving you poisons that put you at the verge of death, and you think that's your only way out. Oof. I've seen a lot of people die from that. And at the beginning of my injury, I hadn't seen any. And now I got a list of people that have died from listening to doctors. And I have no one really on a list of people that tried to take care of themselves and ended up at the same fate. So interesting stuff. But these are powerful lessons that cannot be taken away from you once you've learned them. Kind of goes back to the story, like, or the phrase, like, would you rather teach someone to fish for themselves or would you rather give them fish, right? Once you learn to fish for yourself, then there's nothing you can't handle. After learning how to rectify my own health, I literally have zero concerns on anything that would come at me later in my life. And I'm happy to face it face on. Yeah, it might be a little scary, but I know I can think for myself and handle whatever it is, and I feel comfortable dying and suffering under those conditions, which is a really important, powerful thing to say. So getting back to the dysregulation and the agitation. So you're taking psychiatric drug. Your nervous system is meant to regulate itself. Once you dysregulate it, so you insert something, a drug or a chemical or an experience that changes the way it regulates itself. Now that cadence, that little heartbeat monitor or that seismograph, is, say it's running in a straight line, right? Or say it's dipped because of depression or something, and say now you're forcing it back through a man-made means, right? You're forcing it back into another condition, right? Or to have another cadence or rhythm, right? So not only is that traumatic or irregular, right? It's in violation of nature. So you're forcing it to do something it's not doing already. Not only does that change the rhythm and the cadence, that in itself change the rhythm and the cadence of your nervous system going forward, it now is, since it's forcing like a long-term or a more permanent cadence on it, now you're also losing the ability to bring it back into cadence. So it's kind of, we're kind of stacking these factors against people when we're drugging them or giving them TMS or ECT, or I mean the same goes for a chronic traumatic relationship, whatever it is. Like if you're chronically under stress, you might as well be taking a psychiatric drug every day, because you're forcing your nervous system. You're under stress, so your body's already telling you shouldn't be in this condition. Short term, yeah, it's fine. Just like babies endure a short-term amount of stress, it actually makes them healthier. They get more resilient, right? A certain amount of stress is okay, but the chronic stress, so forcing yourself into a situation you shouldn't be in on a regular basis. I've seen people under chronic stress. I've seen people under psychiatric drugs, and I've seen the nervous system operate in a way that's very similar, if not exact, afterwards. Dysregulation and the weird neurological things that happen because the body doesn't know how to take care of itself anymore, essentially, is really odd, and it's weird, and it plays out in all sorts of ways. We look at people under stress, they endure a whole bunch of extra disease and physiological changes. The same can be said for psychiatric drugs, right? And lots of times we look and we're like, oh, this person under psychiatric drugs, they have a different set of symptoms, and this person who's under chronic stress has a different set of symptoms. That's fine. That's true usually. But two people under the same psychiatric drugs also develop different sets of symptoms, right? So if we looked at a wide enough profile, in my experience, or a wide enough segment of people, we'll actually see that a lot of those things start to overlap. And as I talked to hundreds and then thousands of people in the psychiatric injury community, I saw that people that had extreme stress injuries and some that had withdrawal syndrome from psychiatric drugs, they were actually reacting the same. And when I saw this, I didn't just blow it off and say, oh, that's an interesting coincidence. I said, why? Why is that happening? Why are these two people experiencing the same thing, right? You see a person that had viral meningitis and now has chronic fatigue as a result of it, and you see them acting the same way and displaying the same symptom set as someone that's withdrawal from psychiatric drugs, has been through ECT or TMS, and now has a long-term symptom set, right? They now have the same set of symptoms and are enduring the same things. You can't turn away from it. I mean, you can, of course you can, but if you want to understand if you want the ability to take care of yourself and overcome this kind of situation or help someone else overcome it, the answer is just straight out. Like, you have to work the idea in your mind until you understand why. And that is exactly how I got to the spot that I did. When these things happened, don't get me wrong, I didn't understand them. It took me years to understand them. Each one held such a significant place in my mind that I did not forget them. I wrote them down, or I remembered them. I did whatever I had to do, or I talked about them on the podcast. I talked about them to other people. Other people would bring these stuff back up to me over time. I would re-listen to a podcast and I would remember it over time. I'd reread my notes or reread a journal and understand it and go back to it. And I would say, wow, these things overlapped. Now I understand why, as I was gaining a better knowledge of how this stuff works. So we see this profile emerge, and we can't. People love, the Western mind, it loves to label things and put them in boxes because that's scientific. Yeah, but the way we understand science and science categorization and all that sort of stuff, it's not often very true. I've talked to really puristic scientists before, and it's actually really enlightening and wonderful. Their logic tends to be flawless. They will talk directly about where science works and where it doesn't, and all the missteps that we make in science nowadays. You can't really read a study without a bunch of logical fallacy and flaws in it. I haven't seen a good study performed in a very, very long time. It's all complete trash. It doesn't flow logically from one place to another, which means the ideas and the conclusions that are presented aren't sound. They don't follow the logic tests, right? They may be convincing, right? And I can convince a person of all sorts of stuff that's not true. And this is the way the scientific institutions or establishments, especially medical, have ended up. So you have to think for yourself, right? So we come back to this idea of the dysregulated nervous system and the agitated nervous system. This is what we're talking about primarily, because if you take a child or a person, you expose them to even like a car accident, something that's very violent and has long-lasting effects, that one trauma is still light enough and natural enough to where the body will regulate itself again, especially if it gets good rest and we stay calm and we take good care of ourselves. You might notice that someone that goes through a traumatic event like an accident, they're more prone to stress afterwards, right? So this is our body telling us that we need to rest more and we need to relax more to recover. I don't know if people knew this, or if you knew it, but the instances of getting sick are actually much higher after a traumatic event. Actually, I don't know. Let's reverse that. If you're sick before you go through a traumatic event, the trauma induced is actually much higher, right? So if our nervous system is under stress at the time we go through traumatic events, the trauma is actually much worse. So what does that tell us, right? I'd love to cite a study there, but I can't. It's in a book that I read from a really authentic author that I know, but I've never seen anything to the contrary before. So people that are under stress, they endure trauma much more forcefully, much more brutally. There's, again, look at this cadence, the seismograph, that has a memory, right, that tries to keep itself in rhythm. If you're already out of rhythm and then you push it further out of rhythm with a violent event, it takes longer and it takes more time and it takes more effort to bring that back in. So to kind of progress the idea a little bit, if we chronically stress our nervous system and chronically agitate our nervous system, say we're taking psychiatric drugs every single day for 15 years, right? The ability for our nervous system to regulate itself becomes really defunct. It becomes really bad. And I know that's kind of a subjective term, but I don't really think there's any other good explanation for it. So we're forced it into a certain state of regulation. It kind of normalizes there for a lot of people. They experience some sort of normal, even though they usually are all funky too. They feel dissociated and all sorts of other stuff. Typically, lots of other issues come in because the nervous system might be forced to regulate itself one way, but it can't in another way. And then we just keep taking the drugs, or we get polydrugged. They add drugs to try to regulate other parts of the nervous system. And It can get really ugly. For some people, it actually works decently, and they just are happy with their life in that way. But what happens when we stop? Right? We know that when we stop in a really large group, all sorts of funky stuff starts happening. Right? Like we might get POTS. Our heart might not be able to regulate itself. Our breathing, our nerves, we get twitches. Certainly the sensations like that we experience in our body and our brain and our thoughts and our thinking patterns, they are very, very, very disrupted, very significantly. And the biggest unpleasantness around it is it can take a very, very, very long time to get back on track, right? So primarily when we talk about CNS agitation and dysregulation, this is what we're talking about, right? We're talking about quasi-permanent, right, or what can be or what seems permanent dysregulation of our nervous system. So people, man, they ask so many questions, and I ask so many questions. Why are my legs fasciculating? Why am I exhausted all the time? And then other times I'm so amped up I can't sleep for days and all this stuff, right? Like, you name it, and I've heard it from somebody at some point, which also struck a really big chord in my brain. Like, how come I'm hearing almost every single different kind of human experience coming out of a TMS injury or psychiatric drug injury? Like, people come to me with the weirdest, most random symptoms, right? And I'll be like, wow, okay, I've never heard that one before. I'm filing that away, and I'm going to think about this. Sure enough, like a lot later, I would hear someone else with something really similar or the same. And they'd always ask me, have you met anyone that experienced this before? And I'd be like, yeah, you know what? Like 2 years ago, I ran into so-and-so, and they're experiencing something really similar. Maybe the exact same sensation, but in a different part of the body. Something like that. And sure enough, there would be like a coincidence, right? But you think about it, right? It's not that hard to understand for those that are paying attention and looking deeply into these things so they can understand it and overcome it or master it. Your brain and your spinal cord control everything in your body. Every single last cell is connected. Your heartbeat, your lungs, your stomach, especially your stomach, right? Because then there's all kinds of other living organisms in your stomach that are tied to your nervous system. Like, it gets extraordinarily complex and wild, right? But all those things change the way you experience sensation from your toe to the top of your head. Every last thing is connected. And once you think about this and you understand it and it hits you the right way, then all this stuff makes sense. Everything makes sense. And once you've had an epiphany like that and you realize, okay, that makes sense, everything else can make sense too, and you don't give up until you get it, then you can get there, right? I say that flippantly, right? It took me so many years, and an amount of suffering that could never be measured. I experienced suffering that was far beyond what the human language can communicate, right? So that tells us a lot of things, right? But it also tells us some things that aren't as obvious. And the first one that I like to hammer home to people, and I'll never stop hammering home to people, because I get, in all honesty, I get kind of upset and tired talking to people that don't understand what I'm saying. And that's a flaw of my own, right? That's something I'm working on. It really shouldn't be a big deal. I should expect people not to understand, right? But you might, like, a piece of wisdom that's taken you years and an extraordinary amount of pain to come to, someone to be like, well, I don't get it, or that's ridiculous, or I don't think so. I think something else, right? There's a part of you that cringes inside because, like, oh, it's like I remember when I thought that, and I remember all the suffering I had to go through. Like, and then I think I searched far and wide for someone that could just help me understand what I understand now. And the interesting thing about that is that there may have been people that I came across that did understand, and they tried to tell me, but I couldn't understand it, right? So here is the not so obvious result of all this experience, and because there's like kind of the intellectual and like book learning that you could get out of this stuff. That's like, okay, this information is being presented to me. I think about it and learn to understand it, and I'm good. And then there's things that aren't presented here. Perspective. The reason people don't understand this in the first place in the West, because in other areas of the world this is actually really simple and obvious, but we might think of those people as different or primitive. And we're not worth listening to. And it's kind of ridiculous, right? So perspective is the most valuable thing you can ever possess. More than money or anything. A perspective, maybe it's a kind of wisdom. Wisdom is extremely valuable, right? Character is extremely valuable. But perspective. So what's perspective? Perspective is your ability to see things in a different way. It's your ability to step out of what you're currently thinking and look at things from different angles, right? So the only way we can really get perspective is by listening to other people, right? And accepting that the way you think is not the best way to think, right? And under no circumstances will it ever be the best way to think. There is always a different way to think that is going to be more advantageous, more helpful, and more humble, that is going to give you an understanding that's helpful to you and the people around you, right? So again, going back, like, I may have heard these kind of lessons from people before, but I couldn't understand it because I didn't have perspective. I just thought, oh, well, this person's wacky, or they don't get it, or they're not listening to me, something like that, right? All these dumb ideas come into our head, and we use that as an excuse to overlook what other people are saying, when really anything that we don't understand, no matter how small or how big, we should take the time to try and understand it. And as we start to understand all sorts of different things outside ourselves and outside our current way of thinking, we get better and better at it. And as we get better and better at it, our mind starts to expand, our perspective expands, and all of a sudden, things like solving unexplained nervous system injury become relatively simple, and the answers become simple. And we can then go forward and we look at all these people that are chronically injured in the United States. I mean, the irony isn't lost on me here. If I could communicate to, doctors or people that would listen, the face of the country and the Western civilization would probably change. I'm not so arrogant to think that, like, hey, I'm the one to do that, right? There's lots of people that understand what I understand in different dimensions and different kind of levels, right? And almost all those people are speaking out and trying to get people to change their minds, but they just won't do it. We're way too solution oriented, and we're way too indoctrinated on this idea that if we take a pill that we can look prettier, or our depression can go away, or this or that. And that's like what we need to do, because we don't have enough time to pursue the answers that will fundamentally change the way our body works for the better, right? Because I will tell you, once you get the answer, it's not something you're probably gonna like hearing. When the answer is resting often, like gently stimulating your body every day, working just enough to where you feel stretched but not overstretched, and then resting after that, getting rid of toxic, stressful things in your life, maybe fasting, eating really well, like eating what nature originally intended for people to eat and nothing else. You got fruits, vegetables, and even meat, in my opinion, is fine. These things that haven't been altered in any way, that's what gets us back to regulation. But that's it's a very intensive answer for people that are used to going to the store and being like, I had a bad day, I'm gonna eat ice cream and Cheetos, right? Or I have a pain, so I'm gonna go to a doctor and take a pill or get a procedure done. That's not the answer people want to hear, right? But through our own arrogance, we've built up a place where that is what's generally accepted. If we look back in history, right, we didn't have these answers and we didn't have these things. So our ancestors didn't have access to them, and yet they still took care of themselves. And so I think it's arrogant to think that man can manufacture his answers, and that makes us better than the people in the past, or more entitled to easier answers than people had in the past. That's a slippery slope in a lot of different ways, but if we're focusing on understanding the truth behind it, then it's not a slippery slope. It just means one thing, and that means that we should follow a natural cadence to things, and we should think about everything we do and take care of ourselves and the people around us in that process. It's just that easy, right? And that means in every situation every single relationship, that is a completely different answer, right? There's not like, oh, this is how it looks like here and this is how it looks like there. No, each person's an individual. Each person thinks individually. Our bodies and our minds are more diverse than anything we'll ever be able to see with our eyes around us, right? So that means everyone's constantly becoming to different answers that are better, and more meaningful. And then we share those answers, right? And we gain more wisdom and understanding of the people around us and the things around us, and it evolves. And for us to think that we know what that might look like or what it might evolve into is extremely arrogant as well. As soon as I gave up the idea that I understand what my recovery might look like, or what I might learn from my recovery, or what my body might look like, or what my mind and my family might look like, if I'm on the right path. As soon as I gave that up, I finally was able to let in what actually would be healing and helpful, and those things were all completely different than anything I thought at any given point, right? But it's only when you can accept that you have no idea, right, is that when you can actually get better. Because what is going to make you better is not anything you're thinking about, because guess what? You would have already done it. You would have already thought about it. You would have already figured it out. So again, that comes back to perspective. You have to give up your perspective. You have to start looking through the lenses of other people. Even, in my opinion, even if that's dangerous or violent, right? Doing things that's outside of your perspective. I'm not condoning like physical violence or something, right? That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying violently different, right? Like big changes, right? Doing a cold plunge or something, for someone, it might put them into shock at some point, right? Or if someone's very sensitive, it might be very dangerous, right? But as your nervous system starts to change and regulate itself and come back into balance, or just even start to shift, there are things that you will be able to do that you couldn't before. And it's only by giving up your self-importance that you're going to know the right time and place to do things that might help you along your journey to get better, right? It's a very, very wild course and experience, and I believe that the amount of value that it has is so precious. It's really reserved for those that are brave enough to go down this path of unfamiliarity or risk, right? The nervous system is a very beautiful and amazing thing. So it reacts to foreign experiences and risk and danger in different ways. If we believe that we're going to be harmed by a certain experience that might be dangerous, then that will become toxic and crippling, and we'll develop a traumatic response, and our nervous system will be extremely dysregulated afterwards. If we come at the same experience with an open mind, and we believe that it's possible we could learn something from it and it might be good for us, our experience of that event is entirely different, and it can change the way we think. We're talking now about neuroplasticity, right? Your brain will change and adapt to things as long as we perceive it in kind of a peaceful, indifferent kind of way, right? If we perceive something as harmful and violent and horrible before it's even happened, then the way our body experiences it, interprets it, and stores it is very, 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 very different. And even that little piece of wisdom there, if we just looked through that lens at almost everything that we did, it would change the fundamentals of our human existence as well. It seems simple enough, and some people do understand that, but most people don't get it, right? They're not actually doing it. They're not actually experiencing it. They're not seeing and mastering the kind of change that can bring into life. And again, this isn't an easy answer. This takes time and effort and energy to master that sort of thing. But once we have, what we gain is something extraordinary. We gain the ability to do new things in our life and to grow and to experience, again, neuroplasticity, spiritual, mental, physical growth from those things, and change ourselves in a very, very positive, wonderful way versus a toxic way that will kind of break ourselves down, over time, and continue to, because the more we remember those experiences and we remember them worse and worse and worse, we experience more and more trauma, right? And things can just debilitate and break down, and people essentially die in one way or another from those things. And that's something I experienced. I experienced chronic stress, and then thinking about that chronic stress and making myself worse and worse and worse develop. That's how I got psychiatric diagnoses, right? By going into this crazy spiral. which was perpetuated by all sorts of nasty stuff in my life, and more importantly, what I thought about those nasty things, and my inability to get away from them, or my lack of motivation or will to get away from those things, no matter what the cost. For some reason, in our minds, we build up that if I stop working, I'll die. Well, working a stressful job will kill you, depending on how you perceive that stressful job. So the leave it and figure it out thing is probably a much better option for most people, but I wouldn't believe the amount of resistance I got from people saying, hey, you might have to quit your job or get away from your job in order to get your life back. The percentage of people that were willing to do that was far less than 1%. And I watched people completely break down and lose everything because of that decision, which is really interesting. Again, the opposite, I haven't really ever seen. I've never seen someone quit their job, start over, even in poverty, and have a bad run. Doesn't mean that didn't happen. I just haven't seen it or experienced it yet. So, yep. Okay, so there was a lot going on there, a lot of explanation, and the core of that explanation is trying to, one, explain nervous system agitation and dysregulation, and two, open the door to the additional perspective people might need in order to understand that. I've told enough people that don't understand what I'm saying that I know that perspective is a requirement to understand the things that I just said. With that being said, I'm going to recap and try to be really, really, really clear on what I'm presenting here. So, nervous system dysregulation is something that happens when the nervous system is forced into violent, repetitive changes. The longer we experience those violent, repetitive changes, the longer it will take to overcome that kind of undesirable effect and get back into a more normal or a more pleasant place of living, right? So say you get 30 TMS treatments. Each one is extremely violent on the human nervous system. And you'd say you go 5 days a week, once a day for a month and a half or maybe 2 months, right? Because those are so violent and so much change is happening so rapidly directly to your brain over such a long period of time, it will take years. It can potentially take years of calm, relax, right? Of soothing the nervous system to bring it back into regulation, right? Because it's put into a very, very violent state of agitation and dysregulation. Psychiatric drugs, right? You take them, you have a very violent kind of wrangling of the nervous system that people have done for 15, 20 years, longer than that. The idea of just flipping a switch in the nervous system being able to regulate itself again. Remember, picture that seismograph, something that's been slammed up and down to the top, like for a year straight, right? Something that has memory and it has existence and it has life, right? Asking it to just come and just draw a straight line again after years of being slammed up and down, right? How easy is that going to be, right? So the thing is, if we understand this kind of concept in this paradigm of CNS agitation and dysregulation, then we can bring it back into balance. We can do what we need to do that, right? Another thing to keep in mind is the reason why we're using this generalistic term is because, in my experience, there is no difference between chronic fatigue syndrome, psychiatric drug withdrawal syndrome, TMS injury, ECT injury, chronic stress, viral meningitis, right, long COVID, all these different things. The nervous system is changed and traumatized, right? So the other thing that all these things have in common is there's no diagnostics for any of this stuff, right? So people look fine, right? It's an invisible disease. It's an invisible injury, right? That's telling us something very important. It's not telling us that there is no physical changes, right? There's definitely physical changes that occur. What we're saying is that those physical changes aren't actually significant, and I'm not gaslighting anyone. It's kind of a paradox, which paradoxes are also play an important role, but I'm not going to elaborate on that today, right? There's significant physical changes that change the nervous system and agitate the nervous system, right? But they're also not significant because we know there's some evidence that's not really showing on diagnostics, right? So it's not as significant as like a broken leg or certain kinds of traumatic brain injury, different things that show up, right? But it's traumatically changing the way our nervous system operates. And what we know from people's recoveries is that people do get better, right? And so if we can re-regulate the nervous system, actually there's really no injury there, or the injury is very slight, or it's not that big of a deal, right? But again, it's paradoxical, right? Yes, it's a very big deal because people die all the time with this injury, right? But physiologically looking at the body, there's not much there, right? So someone that was obtuse might say, oh, that means the injury's all in your head. It's not all in your head. It's a physiological change to your nervous system and this cadence and this rhythm that I'm talking about. So our nervous system has a rhythm that can't be observed with diagnostic medicine. It doesn't have a physical rhythm that we can see, right? So, but we can feel it and we can understand it. And that rhythm is essential to life. If you tweak or augment that rhythm, hard enough, any living thing will die, right? If it's in balance well enough, any living thing will experience kind of bliss and like this fantastic kind of experience of life, right? And we see both ends of the spectrum happening. But the fact is that we can try to classify it and do these different things, but it doesn't matter, right? It's words don't kind of defy like value here. I'm just calling it central nervous system agitation and dysregulation, because you can see this thread and you can prove this thread through all of these different injuries, right? And it's really kind of, there's this functional neurological disorder, this FND, these other kinds of ideas that have poked at exactly what it is. But it is a very, very, very real thing. It can be proven, it can be cured, all this stuff, right? But scientific Western ideas of medicine, they are extremely bad with abstract ideas. They're extremely bad with what they do regularly right now, because people have become so obtuse and absent from like wisdom and logic, right? So trying to present this idea that there's an invisible like rhythm to our nervous system that has to be respected and obeyed. And if it's not, we can experience extremely unpleasant things that will land people killed en masse or dead or suffering, right? All the things that most people would like to avoid. But it's very, very real. Like it's there, right? So that's what it is. And so the value of perspective is stepping outside of the things we understand and the way people look at it and realizing there's something there that we don't understand yet that we can grasp to overcome the injury, help the people around it, help ourselves, right? That's what CNS agitation and dysregulation is. That's what I mean by that. So electricity coursing through the brain, anything that's unnatural pushes that rhythm or that cadence off balance, right? The good news is that if it can be pushed off balance, it can be pushed into balance, it can be brought into balance again, like with rest, fasting, all sorts of stuff. For each person is a little bit different. But the other thing that's inescapable, in my opinion, is understanding. You have to understand what it is and how it works in order to bring it back. It's kind of like there's an invisible problem, there's also an invisible solution. Once you understand, which understanding is an invisible thing, how it works, you understand this invisible rhythm, and you can rectify it, right? And by design, it appears that it was meant to be that way, which I think is really fantastic. People that come to me and ask, how'd you do it? How'd you fix it? I can't be like, oh, you know what, there's this pill you can order I'll give you for $50, right? That's really perverted and disgusting, in my opinion. It's a horrible thing. And people that are seeking those answers get, unfortunately, the reward that I received and that lots of them get is that's a really rude awakening at some point, or maybe not. Lots of people die pursuing that kind of answer, like in a pill or something. And some people can't really help it, and that still happens, and that's something I'm struggling to understand. We all struggle to understand, but it does have value and it has meaning. And if anything, it means that we should try to understand this and help others with it as much as we can. So, all right. I think that's pretty good. I could talk on this subject for months and days, but I'll leave it there. I hope that answers questions, or at least begins to. Everybody that's listening, you're wonderful, you're cool. I really appreciate you, and yeah, maybe we'll talk again soon. We'll see.